The first sign that Rusty had not forgotten was not a roar, not a scratch, not even a cry, but the way he stood in the cold morning light, perfectly still, as if the wild had carried him all the way back to the only door he trusted. Hello everyone. Have you ever actually seen a bobcat in the wild? Probably not, right? Today I'm going to tell you the story of this very wild but lovable animal. Before we begin today's story, I have a small request. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos from our channel. This is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more heartwarming stories. Your support means a lot to us. Where are you watching from? Please leave your city or country in the comments below. Thank you so much. Now let's begin the story about this animal. The October air in northern Montana had teeth that morning, sharp enough to turn every breath into a pale cloud. Nora Whitaker was rinsing a coffee mug at the small wildlife rescue cabin when she heard the sound. Tap, tap, tap. Not loud, not frantic. Just 3 careful touches against the back door, spaced so evenly that she froze with her hand still under the running water. At first, she thought a branch had fallen from the old pine beside the porch. Then it came again, softer this time, followed by a low sound from outside, thin and rough, almost swallowed by the wind. Nora dried her hands and moved toward the door slowly. Living at the edge of 200 acres of rescue land had taught her never to open a door quickly, not in bear country, not with coyotes passing through at dawn, and certainly not when the forest sounded too quiet. She turned the lock and opened the door just a few inches. A pair of golden eyes looked back at her. Nora stopped breathing. On the porch stood a full-grown male bobcat, his spotted coat thick with frost, his short tail twitching once, his tufted ears angled forward. Every part of him said wild. The shoulders, the stillness, the silent warning in his stance. But on his left ear was a pale nick, a tiny crescent-shaped scar Nora had seen years before, on a trembling cub wrapped in a faded blue towel. "Rusty?" she whispered. The bobcat did not run. He only stared at her, tired and tense, as if he had spent the whole night arguing with every instinct that told him humans were dangerous. Then a tiny sound came from behind him. Nora looked past his legs toward the huckleberry bushes at the edge of the porch, where the frost had bent the leaves silver. Something moved there, then something else. One small face appeared, then another, each with wide kitten eyes and muddy little paws tucked beneath shivering bodies. Nora's throat tightened. Rusty had come back, but this time, he had not come alone. For a moment, Nora could not move. The little faces beneath the huckleberry bushes were so small, they seemed unreal against the cold grey morning, just trembling shapes with spotted fur and eyes too round for the world they had already survived. Rusty stood between her and them, his body angled like a living gate, every muscle tight, every breath visible in the frosty air. He had brought them to the cabin, but he had not yet decided whether he could let a human touch them. Nora understood that better than anyone. Years earlier, he had looked at her the same way, not as a friend, not as a savior, but as one more frightening thing in a world that had already hurt him. Back then, Rusty had been no larger than a house cat, found near an old service road after a late spring storm had washed mud across the gravel. A ranger had carried him in a crate lined with towels, telling Nora that the cub was cold, weak, and refusing everything. She still remembered the first time she saw him under the exam light. His tiny body curled so tightly that he looked more like a fist of wet fur than a bobcat. His left ear had been nicked, his back leg sore, his whole body shaking from exhaustion and fear. When Nora reached toward him, he hissed with all the strength he had left, but the sound came out thin and broken, like a match trying to become a fire. For 3 nights, she slept in a chair beside his warming box, waking every hour to check his breathing, to offer formula, to whisper words he could not understand but somehow seemed to hear. He did not trust the bottle. He did not trust the blanket. He did not trust the hand that tried to help him. Yet on the 4th morning, when the sun slipped through the blinds and touched the blue towel around him, Rusty lifted his head and pressed his small chin against Nora's wrist. It was not affection, not exactly. It was more fragile than that. It was surrender mixed with hope. From that day on, he fought to live. He learned to stand again. He learned to pounce at leaves, to stalk shadows, to hide his food, as if the forest had already begun calling him back. Nora never treated him like a pet. She kept her distance when he grew stronger, spoke less, handled him only when necessary, because loving a wild animal sometimes meant teaching it not to need you. The morning they released him, he paused at the edge of the pines and looked back once. His amber eyes held hers for only a second before he disappeared into the tall grass, and Nora told herself that was the best ending any rescue could have. A wild heart returned to the wild. She never expected to see him again. But now, 4 years later, that same bobcat stood on her porch with frost on his whiskers and worry in his eyes, guarding a cluster of kittens, too young to understand why their father had brought them to a human door. Nora took one slow step back into the cabin and reached for a clean towel from the shelf by the sink. Rusty watched every movement. His ears flicked, his paws shifted. Behind him, one of the smallest kittens made a faint, squeaking cry and tried to crawl closer to the warmth spilling through the doorway. Rusty turned instantly, lowering his head to touch the kitten with his nose. The gesture was so gentle that Nora felt her chest tighten. This was not the restless cub she had once saved. This was a father stretched past fear, past pride, past everything a wild creature should allow. Nora crouched low, keeping her hands visible, the towel folded loosely in her palms. "I remember you," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind. "And I think you remember me too." Rusty looked at her, then at the kittens, then back toward the dark line of trees beyond the yard. For the first time, Nora noticed the dried mud along his legs, the burrs caught in his coat, and the deep tiredness in the way he stood. He had traveled far. He had made a choice no bobcat should have needed to make. And when the weakest kitten cried again, Rusty slowly stepped aside. Nora did not move toward the kittens right away. She knew the few inches Rusty had given her were not permission to rush. They were trust balanced on the edge of fear. One careless step, one sudden sound, and the wild part of him could take over again. So she stayed low on the wooden threshold with the towel in her hands, letting the warmth from the cabin drift past her into the cold morning. The smallest kitten had crawled halfway out from under the huckleberry bush, its tiny paws slipping on the frosted boards at the edge of the porch. Its coat was damp with mist, and its little body trembled so hard that Nora could see the movement from several feet away. Rusty lowered his head and nudged the kitten back with a careful touch of his nose, but the baby only gave another weak cry and turned toward the open door, as if it understood that warmth lived inside. Nora whispered softly, not to Rusty alone, but to the whole frightened little family, "Easy, nobody is going to hurt you." Rusty's ears twitched at her voice. His eyes stayed locked on her hands. Nora slowly unfolded the towel and set it on the porch between them, then slid it forward with just 2 fingers. Rusty leaned down to smell it. He did not relax, but he did not pull the kittens away either. That was enough. Nora reached behind her without standing and grabbed a shallow dish of warm goat milk formula she kept for emergency kitten cases. She placed it beside the towel. The smell reached the kittens first. One lifted its head. Another stumbled from the leaves. Then Nora saw more movement behind the bush, little shadows pressed together, too many for her to count at a glance. Rusty stepped sideways, blocking her view again, his body tense and proud, despite the exhaustion in his legs. A low growl rolled from his throat. It was not rage. It was a warning, and Nora respected it. "I know," she said gently. "They are yours. I know." The words seemed to settle in the space between them. Rusty looked down at the weakest kitten, the one still shivering near the towel. For several seconds, he stood absolutely still. Then he did something Nora would remember for the rest of her life. He bent his head, took the tiny kitten gently by the loose fur at the back of its neck, and lifted it with astonishing care. Nora's heart pounded as Rusty walked toward her. Every instinct in her body told her not to reach. Not yet. The bobcat stopped less than 2 feet away. His golden eyes met hers, fierce and frightened and impossibly tired. Then he lowered the kitten onto the towel at her knees and backed away. Nora swallowed hard. The kitten was so light it barely dented the folded fabric. It made a thin sound, hardly more than breath. Nora wrapped the towel around it with slow hands, feeling the faint flutter of life beneath the cloth. Rusty watched closely, his paws planted, his shoulders tight, but he did not stop her. Behind him, the other kittens began to stir, drawn by warmth, hunger, and the small courage of the first one. Nora tucked the tiny bundle against her chest and felt its shivering begin to slow. For a heartbeat, she forgot the cold. She forgot the years since Rusty had vanished into the pines. All she could see was the impossible trust of a wild father placing his weakest baby into human hands. Then another kitten cried from deeper beneath the bush, and Rusty turned sharply toward the sound. Nora followed his gaze and finally saw what the leaves had hidden. There were more kittens than she had realized, more small bodies pressed together in the frost, and one of them was not moving toward the milk at all. Nora held the first kitten close against the front of her fleece jacket, letting her body heat seep through the towel, while her eyes stayed on the one still hidden beneath the bush. It lay half-tucked under a curl of frost-stiff leaves, smaller than the others, with its tiny chin resting on the cold ground. For one terrible second, Nora feared she was too late. Then its ear flickered. Barely, but enough. Rusty saw it too. He moved before Nora could, stepping around the huckleberry bush with the careful urgency of a father who had already carried more fear than his body could hold. He nosed the weak kitten once, then again, and when it did not lift its head, a sound came from him that did not belong to any wild predator Nora had ever heard. It was low, strained, almost pleading. The other kittens were beginning to creep toward the dish of warm formula, their little paws sliding on the porch boards, their bodies bumping into one another in clumsy confusion. Nora counted them as they appeared, 1 in her arms, 2 at the dish, 3 under Rusty's chest, 4 near the porch step, 5, 6, 7. 7 kittens. Nora's breath caught. That was too many for one exhausted bobcat father to protect, warm, and guide through a cold night alone. Rusty looked thinner than he should have at this time of year, his flanks drawn in, his coat rough with dried mud and pine needles. There were burrs tangled along his shoulder and a shallow scrape near one foreleg, not fresh enough to panic over, but clear enough to tell Nora he had pushed through brush, distance, and danger to get here. He was not wandering. He had made a decision. Nora shifted the first kitten into a small heated carrier just inside the doorway, keeping the door wide enough for Rusty to see every movement. She did not want him to think she was taking the baby away. She wanted him to understand that warmth was only a few feet from where he stood. "I need help," she whispered, more to herself than to him. With one hand still visible, she reached for her phone on the counter and called Caleb Morris, the local ranger who handled wildlife emergencies in the surrounding foothills. When he answered, his voice was still thick with sleep. Nora kept her own voice low and steady. "Caleb, I need you at the rescue cabin. Rusty is here." There was a pause on the line. "Rusty? As in your Rusty?" Nora looked through the doorway at the male bobcat, standing over 7 shivering kittens, his golden eyes darting from the babies to the tree line and back again. "Yes," she said, "and he brought kittens, a lot of them." Caleb did not ask unnecessary questions after that. He only said he was on his way. Nora ended the call and slid another towel onto the porch. Rusty allowed the 2 strongest kittens to stumble onto it, though he stayed close enough that his whiskers nearly brushed Nora's sleeve. Each time she moved a kitten toward the carrier, he followed, tense and silent, watching through the open door as if memorizing where she placed them. He still would not come inside. He remained on the threshold, one paw on the porch, one paw angled toward the yard, divided between the human warmth in front of him and the forest behind him. Then Nora noticed something stranger. Rusty was not simply checking on the kittens. Every minute or so, he turned his head toward the pines beyond the cabin. Not in fear, not exactly. In expectation, as if part of him was still listening for someone who had not followed. The morning brightened slowly, turning the frost silver across the grass. In the distance, an engine approached along the gravel road, and Rusty stiffened at once. His ears flattened, his body lowered. Nora raised one hand before Caleb's truck even came into view, silently warning him to stop far back. The truck rolled to a careful halt near the woodpile, more than 30 yards away. Caleb stepped out slowly, wearing his ranger jacket, hands open, no sudden movement. Rusty watched him with a hard stare, the wildness returning to his face like a door closing. But he did not run. Instead, he walked to the edge of the porch, looked once at the carrier full of warming kittens, then turned toward the trees. He took 5 steps into the frosted grass and stopped. Nora knew that posture. She had seen it in injured animals, in lost dogs, in frightened mothers guarding dens. Rusty was not finished asking for help. Caleb saw it too, and spoke barely above a whisper. "Nora, I think he wants us to follow him." Rusty looked back at them, his breath rising in pale clouds, his eyes tired but steady. Then he faced the dark line of pines again, waiting. Nora did not follow Rusty right away. She first checked the carrier inside the doorway, making sure the warming pad was on low and the kittens were tucked safely beneath soft towels. Their tiny cries had softened into sleepy breaths, and for a moment the sound gave her enough courage to step back into the cold. Caleb stood near the edge of the driveway, careful not to come too close. He had handled enough wildlife calls to know that a wild animal asking for help was still wild, and a bobcat with babies nearby deserved more respect than fear. Rusty waited at the edge of the grass, half hidden by the pale trunks of the pines. He looked back only once, then slipped between the trees with a slow, uneven stride. Nora noticed it immediately. He was not limping badly, but he was tired, too tired for a healthy male bobcat in his own territory. Every few yards, he stopped and turned, making sure they were behind him. Not too close, not too far, just close enough to understand. Nora pulled on her gloves and followed with Caleb a few steps behind, carrying a small rescue pack with towels, heat packs, and a collapsible carrier. The forest swallowed the cabin quickly. Within minutes, the warmth of the porch disappeared behind them, replaced by the damp scent of pine needles, cold earth, and last night's mist. Frost clung to the low brush in tiny white beads. Their boots made soft crunching sounds over frozen leaves, but Rusty moved almost silently ahead of them, a shadow with golden eyes. The deeper they went, the more the story appeared on the ground. Nora saw tiny paw prints pressed into the soft mud beside larger bobcat tracks. Some crossed over each other in confused circles. Others dragged through the leaves as if the kittens had been too weak to walk straight. Caleb crouched beside a patch of disturbed soil and pointed without speaking. A strip of dried grass had been flattened into a narrow path, the kind made by repeated trips over a short period. Rusty had not carried those kittens from nearby. He had moved them one by one, possibly through the dark, possibly through the cold, returning again and again, until his body nearly gave out. Nora's chest tightened at the thought. Ahead, Rusty stopped near a fallen pine and lowered his head to sniff the ground. His ears turned toward the north slope. A raven called somewhere above them, and the sound seemed to make the entire forest pause. Caleb stepped closer to Nora and whispered, "Something happened out here." Nora already knew. She could feel it in Rusty's posture. He was not leading them like an animal searching for food. He was leading them like a father, returning to a place he could not fix alone. They moved another quarter-mile through the trees, down a shallow dip where the frost grew thicker and the air felt colder. Nora spotted more signs now. A tuft of tan fur caught gently on a blackberry cane, a place where leaves had been pushed aside, a small hollow beneath a rotting log where something had rested briefly. Rusty kept stopping at each one, touching his nose to the ground, then looking back at her. Each pause felt like a sentence he could not speak. "Here, here, I tried here." The path narrowed between two boulders, and Rusty slowed even more. His breath came in pale clouds. His shoulders rose and fell with effort. Nora wanted to call him back, wanted to tell him he had already done enough, but he pressed forward, driven by something stronger than exhaustion. Finally, the trees opened into a small sheltered pocket at the base of a rocky slope. Broken branches formed a loose arch beneath an old cedar root, the kind of hidden place a bobcat might choose for a den. Rusty stopped 10 feet from it and did not go closer. Instead, He lowered his body to the ground, ears flattened, eyes fixed on the dark opening. Nora felt the hairs rise along the back of her neck. From inside the den came a sound so faint it could have been wind moving through leaves. Then it came again, a tiny cry, weak, thin, and alone. Rusty turned his head toward Nora, and in his exhausted golden eyes she saw the truth before she understood it. The kittens at the cabin were not all of them. Nora lowered herself beside the den opening, keeping her movement slow enough that even the leaves seemed louder than her hands. Rusty stayed several feet away, crouched in the frost, with his eyes fixed on the hollow beneath the cedar root. He was close enough to guard, but far enough to let her try. That distance said everything. He still belonged to the forest. He still trusted his own teeth, his own speed, his own silence, more than any human promise. But something inside that dark den mattered more to him than fear. Nora opened her rescue pack and pulled out a small flashlight, angling the beam toward the ground instead of straight into the hollow. She did not want to scare whatever was inside. The tiny cry came again, thinner this time, almost lost beneath the rustle of the branches overhead. Caleb knelt on the other side of the den, his face pale with concern but calm. "I see movement," he whispered. Nora leaned closer, and at first all she saw was shadow, dry grass, and the curved wall of roots. Then two small shapes shifted in the back of the den. Bobcat kittens. They were tucked against each other, colder than the ones at the cabin, their little bodies dusty with soil and bits of cedar bark. One lifted its head and opened its mouth, but almost no sound came out. Nora felt the familiar pull of urgency rise in her chest, but she forced herself not to rush. "I have them," she whispered. Rusty made a soft sound behind her, and when Nora glanced back, his front paws were pressed into the ground so hard his claws had left tiny marks in the frost. She reached into the den with a towel wrapped around her hand, speaking softly the entire time. The first kitten fit in her palm like a warm thought that had almost gone cold. She wrapped it immediately and passed it to Caleb, who slid a heat pack beneath the towel and held the bundle close inside his jacket. The second kitten was farther back, wedged near a root. Nora had to lie flat on the cold ground to reach it, feeling damp earth press through her sleeve. Rusty rose halfway, tense, but he did not interfere. He only watched. When Nora finally eased the second kitten free, it gave one small cry, and Rusty answered with a low, trembling chirp that made Caleb look up in silence. It was not the sound of a hunter. It was the sound of a father hearing one more heartbeat return to the world. Nora backed away from the den and checked both kittens quickly. They were weak, chilled, and hungry, but they were alive. For the first time since leaving the cabin, she allowed herself a breath. Then Rusty moved to the far side of the cedar root and began pawing at a patch of leaves near a flat grey stone. Not digging wildly, not frantic, deliberate. Again and again he touched the same place, then looked at Nora. Caleb shifted closer and brushed away the leaves. Underneath was an old piece of weathered rope, half buried in the soil, tangled with dried grass and rust-colored pine needles. A bent metal loop lay beside it, dull and stiff with age, the kind of forgotten hazard no animal should ever find. Nora's stomach sank. She did not need to imagine the worst. She only needed to see Rusty's face. He lowered his head and sniffed the ground beside the old trap, then turned toward the deeper trees with a soft, searching cry. Somewhere out there was the reason he had become a father alone. Somewhere out there was the missing mother who had kept these kittens warm before the cold reached them. Caleb picked up the old hazard carefully with gloved hands and placed it inside an evidence bag from his ranger kit. His voice was quiet. "This has been out here a long time." Nora looked at Rusty. The bobcat stood in the pale morning light, his coat rough, his eyes tired, his whole body pulled between the den, the rescued kittens, and the empty forest beyond. He had not brought Nora here only to save what remained in the den. He had brought her to understand why he had returned at all. Then, from somewhere beyond the rocks, a sound drifted through the trees. It was faint, uncertain, and not quite like the cry of a bobcat kitten. Rusty froze. Rusty did not move for several seconds. The old forest seemed to hold its breath around him, every pine branch still, every patch of frost shining faintly beneath the pale morning sky. Nora heard the sound again, a small cry from beyond the rocks, softer than the bobcat kittens and higher in pitch, as if whatever made it had used nearly all its strength just to be heard. Rusty turned his head slowly toward Nora, and the look in his eyes changed. Until that moment, he had been tense, tired, and watchful. But now there was something deeper in him, something almost desperate. He stepped away from the den and moved toward a narrow gap between two boulders, then stopped and looked back. Caleb held the two rescued kittens close inside his jacket, while Nora followed Rusty with the rescue pack pressed against her shoulder. The path beyond the rocks was tight and uneven, no wider than a deer trail, with damp leaves packed between stones and thin roots crossing the ground like dark threads. Rusty slipped through first, his body low, his ears turning at every sound. Nora had to place one hand against the cold rock to steady herself. After 20 feet, the narrow trail opened into a smaller hollow hidden behind the slope, so well covered by cedar branches that Nora would have walked past it 100 times and never known it was there. Rusty stopped at the entrance. He did not go in. He sat down heavily, as if the last few steps had taken everything from him, and stared into the shadows. Nora knelt and listened. There it was again, a tiny cry. Then another, not from one animal, but several. She moved the branches aside with careful fingers, and her breath caught. Tucked inside a torn canvas tote were 3 house kittens, no more than a few weeks old, their soft coats dirty from the forest floor, their little bodies pressed together for warmth. They were not bobcats. They had no spotted wild coats, no tufted ears, no short tails. They were ordinary domestic kittens, the kind that belonged in a laundry basket lined with blankets, not in a cold hollow half a mile from the nearest road. Nora stared at them, unable to speak. Caleb came up behind her and went still. Rusty lowered his head, sniffed the edge of the tote, and made a quiet sound that was almost a sigh. That was when Nora understood the shape of the story he had been trying to tell her all morning. The bobcat mother had not only protected her own babies. Somehow, before she disappeared, she had found these abandoned kittens and pulled them into the only shelter she had. She had given them the same warmth, the same hidden safety, the same chance she had given her own. And after she was gone, Rusty had stayed. A wild male bobcat, built for distance and silence, had guarded not only his own cubs, but 3 helpless babies that were not even his species. He had gone back and forth through the cold, gathering the strongest, returning for the weakest, carrying a family too large for one father and too fragile for the woods. Nora felt her eyes sting, but she kept her hands steady. The kittens needed warmth, not tears. She wrapped the tote in a towel, checking each tiny body with gentle fingers. They were cold and hungry, but alive. Rusty watched her with the same fierce focus he had shown at the cabin, but this time, when Nora lifted the tote, he did not growl. He only stepped closer and placed one paw lightly against the towel. Not enough to stop her, not enough to claim them back, just enough to make her pause. Nora looked into his golden eyes, and for one quiet second, the years between them disappeared. The storm-wet cub in the blue towel, the wild young bobcat vanishing into the grass, the father standing now in a hidden hollow with a family he could not save alone. "I have them," Nora whispered. Rusty held her gaze a moment longer, then he lowered his paw. The walk back to the cabin felt longer than the walk into the woods. Caleb carried the 2 bobcat kittens against his chest, wrapped in towels warmed by heat packs, while Nora held the canvas tote of house kittens carefully in both arms. Rusty followed beside them, not too close, never tame, but close enough that every few steps Nora could hear the quiet sound of his breathing behind her. The forest looked different now. The same pines stood tall and dark. The same frost clung to the grass. The same ravens called from somewhere high above. But Nora could no longer see it as an empty stretch of wilderness. Everywhere she looked, she imagined Rusty moving through it in the dark, carrying one tiny life at a time, returning again and again, because leaving any of them behind had somehow become impossible to him. When the cabin finally appeared through the trees, a thin ribbon of smoke curled from the chimney, and the back door still stood open just enough to show the warm light inside. The kittens in the heated carrier had grown quieter, no longer crying with panic, only shifting beneath the towels in soft little movements. Rusty stopped at the edge of the yard. His eyes went to the carrier first, then to the bundle in Caleb's jacket, then to the tote in Nora's arms. He was counting them in his own way, not with numbers, but with scent, sound, and the anxious memory of every small body he had tried to protect. Nora stepped onto the porch and slowly lowered the canvas tote beside the carrier. The 3 house kittens stirred as the warmth reached them, their tiny mouths opening in silent, hungry motions. Caleb moved the 2 Bobcat kittens into the carrier with the others, placing each one where Rusty could see. Nora expected Rusty to stay back, to keep his distance from the doorway, as he had before. Instead, he came up the porch, steps one careful paw at a time. His shoulders were low, his ears were angled forward. Every movement carried the question he could not ask. Nora opened the carrier door wider and shifted the towels so all the kittens were visible. 7 Bobcat babies, each still fragile, each breathing. 3 house kittens, tucked together in the corner, small and pale against the darker spotted coats around them. 10 little lives under one roof, because a wild father had remembered a human door. Rusty stood at the threshold and looked inside. For the first time that morning, the tension in his body seemed to loosen, not disappear. A bobcat never truly let go of the wild. But something in him softened. He lowered his head until his nose nearly touched the edge of the carrier, breathing in the scent of warmth, milk, towel, and life. One of the bobcat kittens, the first one he had given to Nora, lifted its tiny head and made a faint squeak. Rusty answered with a quiet chirp, so tender and unexpected that Caleb looked away for a moment, blinking hard. Nora prepared more formula and began feeding the weakest babies one by one with a small syringe, slow drops, patient hands, no rushing. Rusty watched every motion. When one kitten coughed softly and squirmed, his body tightened. When it settled again, his shoulders eased. He did not understand medicine or heat settings or rescue protocols. He understood only that the small ones were still here, still breathing, still together. Late in the morning, Nora called a veterinary center in town and arranged for an emergency neonatal wildlife transfer. She spoke quietly, giving only the facts, but her voice wavered when she explained that 3 of the kittens were domestic and had somehow been sheltered with the bobcat litter. The veterinarian on the phone went silent for a moment before saying they would prepare separate warmers and round-the-clock care. As Nora hung up, Rusty stepped closer. He placed one front paw lightly on the edge of the towel near her hand. Again, not to stop her, not to claim, just to make sure. Nora looked down at him, at the scar on his left ear, at the frost melting from his whiskers, at the eyes that still carried the forest inside them. "Yes," she whispered, "all of them." Rusty held still, as if weighing her words by tone alone. Then he turned his head toward the carrier, where the smallest house kitten had curled against a bobcat cub twice its size. The wild father watched them for a long, silent moment, and Nora understood that this was the real miracle. Not that Rusty had returned, not that he had brought so many kittens, but that somewhere in the cold and fear of the forest, a creature born to survive alone had chosen to protect the helpless, even when they were not his own. By the time the veterinary transport arrived, the sun had climbed above the pines and turned the frost along the cabin steps into clear beads of water. The little ones were wrapped, warmed, and breathing more steadily now, their cries no longer sharp with panic, but soft and sleepy beneath the towels. Nora carried the first heated carrier to the rescue van, while Caleb carried the second, both moving slowly so Rusty could see exactly where the babies were going. The bobcat stood at the edge of the porch, silent as stone, his golden eyes following every step. He did not try to stop them. He did not rush the van. He only watched, shoulders low, whiskers damp from melted frost, as if he understood that this part of saving them required him to let go. Nora paused, before closing the van door and turned the carrier slightly so Rusty could see the tiny faces inside one last time. A bobcat cub shifted under the towel. One of the house kittens let out a small, squeaky cry. Rusty's ears lifted. For one breath, the wild father took a single step forward, and Nora thought he might come all the way to her. But he stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked at the carrier, then at Nora, and gave one quiet chirp that seemed to carry every mile he had walked, every cold hour he had stood guard, every impossible choice he had made at the edge of fear. "They are safe," Nora said, her voice breaking softly. "You did it." The van rolled away slowly down the gravel road toward the veterinary center in town, where the bobcat kittens would receive wildlife care and the house kittens would be placed with neonatal foster volunteers. Rusty watched until the last flash of white disappeared between the trees. Only then did he turn back toward the forest. Nora expected him to vanish immediately, the way he had years before, but he did not. For the next 3 days, Rusty stayed near the cabin. He never came inside. He never let anyone touch him. He slept in the shelter of the pines and appeared at dawn and dusk, standing where he could see the back door, waiting for sounds that were no longer there. Nora left water near the woodpile and kept her distance. She knew better than to turn gratitude into possession. Rusty was not hers. He had never been hers. He was a wild heart that had remembered kindness when he needed it most. A week later, the first update came from the veterinary center. All 10 kittens had survived the critical window. The 7 bobcat babies were gaining weight and would be moved to a protected rehabilitation enclosure once they were stronger. The 3 house kittens had begun nursing with a foster cat in town, tucked safely in a warm home, far from the cold hollow where they had been found. Nora listened to the message twice, then stepped outside with tears in her eyes. Rusty was standing beyond the fence line, half hidden in the golden evening grass. She did not know how long he had been there. "They made it," she called softly. Rusty did not understand the words, not the way people do, but he seemed to understand her voice. His ears came forward. His tired eyes softened. Then, after a long, still moment, he turned and walked into the trees, his spotted coat dissolving into shadow. Months passed. Snow came and melted. Spring returned to the Montana foothills in green waves. One evening, Nora checked the trail camera behind the cabin and found a clip that made her sit down without speaking. Rusty crossed the frame at sunset, stronger now, moving with the quiet confidence of the forest. Behind him came several young bobcats, taller, healthier, their spotted coats bright in the amber light. They did not approach the cabin. They did not need to. Rusty stopped only once and looked toward the back door, the same door where he had stood with fear, trust, and a family too fragile for the wild. Then he led the young ones into the trees, not as a pet, not as a tame animal, but as what he had always been meant to be: wild, tender, free. And Nora understood that some rescues do not end with an animal staying. Sometimes the most beautiful ending is watching them leave, knowing they lived because, for one desperate morning, the wild remembered where kindness lived.